Hey, Joshua with Cultural Catholic coming at you live with another episode of the miniseries on Indian history, with a specific look at colonial and military history. Specifically, today we'll be looking at the Indian contributions during World War One. However, when I wrote the paper, I was focusing specifically on their contributions in Europe, since that would have been uh, a lot of things to look at. So I had to focus on very specifically, and that's what I'll talk about today. I think I'll try to get some research done for a little bit broader sense after. Um, but yeah, so starting in 1914 when the war was started, um, not a lot of people thought it would last long. Thought that it'd be over by Christmas, but it became pretty clear as time went on that Britain would not have the manpower to successfully fight the war effectively. So as they had the smallest army of any European power, so they started to bring in a ready reserve of well-trained troops, and that would be the British Indian Army. Now, there are a few issues with that on the onset. The Indian Army reserves were not very well staffed. Many of the reservists that came in were so old that they were down to like one, that they were physically older. They were in their 40s. They were not really effect in their late 40s going into early 50s were not as effective in fighting. There's actually a story of one man coming in and he only had one tooth left. And they're like, I don't, and they were not. They were questioning his health, and he just took out his tooth when they questioned him about it. And he's like, here's the tooth. When do you want the tooth? Um, there were also issues of specific equipment. They did not have a lot of artillery. Most of the artillery was mountain artillery. So it's not that they had, and that was actual British Army artillery, and they actually couldn't take that away because that was defending the mountain passes into Afghanistan. Um, so they had to have actual units that were on site, either French or British or Belgian, assigned to them. And additionally, they also had to be trained in the new use of the new rifle because they were given outdated equipment. Um, so they had to train on that as well. Now, when they were actually put into the fighting, initially it was fairly piecemeal, and they were ordered never to retreat unless they're to never retreat, and that caused a huge number of casualties, not only among the Indian sepoys themselves, but also their British officers. They had actually some of the highest um, casualty rates of any officer corps, and a lot of experienced junior officers had been on leave at the time and were commandeered by the uh, by Kitchener during the training of Kitchener's army to get a lot of those volunteers up to snuff. And so they lost a lot of good experience, and there were Indian officers, but they were outranked by sergeants, British sergeants, not even like color sergeants, which would make a little sense because they're the highest ranking officer, non-commissioned officer in a regiment, but a buck sergeant would be able to override their orders. Um, and actually did participate in a lot of battles and distinguished themselves quite well. Neuve Chapelle, uh, one of I can't remember exactly, but Neuve Chapelle was the first major battle that they participated in. The flanking units were European, but the one that took the town of Neuve Chapelle was Indian, and they took a huge amount of casualties. Um, and in essence, most of the actions that the Indians took were used as shock troops. And even though they weren't exactly trained for that, and weren't exactly able to replenish as easily, since men who were recruited were typically put into not the units that needed them most, but into units that fit their ethnic group as the martial race plan dictated. So that caused a lot of manpower issues with units, which was also already a problem because most British Indian units were about half strength compared to British units. So a company would be, say, 150 for a regular British unit, let's say. So a British Indian Army company would be half of that. So they didn't have a lot of men already. They were losing tons of men as time went on, and they did not get as effective replacements, both for officers and for enlisted men as well. And so those were big issues. By 1916, all infantry units were transferred to the African and Middle Eastern theaters. Part of the issue was Indian troops were not as well prepared for cold environments, and a lot of colonial troops were not. And so that caused them to have low morale, which can be an issue in a long attrition-based warfare. Cavalry units were maintained until 1918, when they were moved to the Middle East. But since cavalry was not really an option, they themselves also operated as infantry. Although Battle of the Somme, they were prepared and actually used as cavalry, um, partially because of how the plan for the Somme was supposed to go. It was supposed to become this massive breakthrough, and then cavalry were supposed to storm through the breach to, end the war. But that didn't work out. So, yeah, by 1918, there were no Indian soldiers on the continent. They were all in the Middle East or Africa. So that was the end of their contribution as soldiers. Now, what's really interesting is with this is the cultural elements and other things that they experienced. For one, they actually met European white women who were of the same or lower social class than them, which was very new for them because the only women they ever met were officers' wives, and they were typically of a higher socioeconomic background than the Indian soldiers themselves. So they were used to having these prim and proper upper middle class and upper class women walking around, looking down on them, treating them like servants. However, when they encountered these women who were working or lower middle class, they didn't really understand it at first, and they actually started to have sexual relations with them. That was a very common thing, which caused quite a bit of stir among more conservative Europeans who were afraid and followed the trope of the dark man taking their women away, which was kind of dumb. But they're human. The women were human. They're gonna have sex. It's part of life. Now, their other experience with women was kind of motherly. Whenever they were on leave or in the very very far back of the line or taken off of the line, they would, and in France they would sometimes be assigned to a village to spend time in to relax, and that would mean spending time with the French citizens. And there are stories of these Indian troops basically forming like a mother-son relationship with these women. There's actually one story of a woman who lost one son to the fighting. He was dead, and had two other sons who were off fighting in France. And this was a French woman, and she had in her house a Sikh soldier, and they got along very well. She treated him like one of her sons, like he was one of her own. And they got really close, and he was really sad when he had to leave, and she was just as equally sad when he had to leave. Um, so there are a lot of really interesting connections that were formed. Additionally, a lot of these soldiers were from peasant farming communities, and when they saw Europe, they saw this beautiful and bountiful place that they could learn from, that they could take as an example of how to figure out how to create an abundance, which was something that they were concerned about because a lot of farming at the time had switched over from subsistence or food crops to cash crops, cotton, tobacco, things of that nature. Um, and so when looking at it, they thought, how could we take the techniques that they have and transfer it not only to the crops that we grow to make money, but also grow food. And go on to go a little bit further on things that they could use to improve their society, a lot of so the way advancement was viewed by a lot of Europeans is that white people were just predisposed to being technologically and educationally advanced, um, and that stems from the racist theories that were around back then. However, Indian soldiers viewed it a lot differently. They viewed it as like what they put their priorities behind. And one thing that East Indians, did not put a lot of emphasis behind was educating their daughters, um, because, and this was something that happened at the time. Uh, Technically, it happened in both, but they did not put as much emphasis in educating their daughters as they did educating their sons, simply because they thought the daughters would not be able to help them advance as much as they thought their sons were. But when they came to Europe and they saw the education that both men and women had, they thought, well, if we were to educate our daughters, we could become as technologically advanced as the Europeans are. And a lot of soldiers would write back to their families that they should educate their children, their daughters, just as much as their sons, so that they can become part of the economic and international powers that Europe and that Britain and France were all a part of. And what is also interesting is that a lot of Indian soldiers were taken prisoner during the war, and so uh, camps in POW camps, this was an opportunity for German anthropologists and sociologists to study, and even linguists to study the various cultures and languages and belief systems that exist on the Indian subcontinent and kind of expand their understanding of these cultures and peoples. So it was a great, even though it was a war, it was a great opportunity to try to foster better understanding of the world around them. Um, Again, it was a violent, brutal war. Millions of men died, a good number of them from India. But this was also a very interesting chance for the people of India, exclusively in this case, the men who were in the Indian army, to experience the world around them and uh, to learn about a place that they'd only heard about from their officers or um, or the colonial rulers that they had over them. So next week I will talk about post-war things that happened after that, and go a little bit further on that, or that might be pushed back a week, and I'll do a bit on the Middle East and Africa for the Indian Army. This is Joshua with Cultural Catholic signing off.